Hey book buddies, it's been 64 days since my last upload, and I finished chapter 16 a few days ago with 1,964 words. When I first started, I was able to write a whole chapter in about 2 weeks, so this is much slower than usual. So for the first 2 months, what happened? I remember for the first 2, maybe 3 weeks, I had trouble just starting the first few lines. I knew what the chapter was going to be about, but the language, the words were not right. I know for the first draft, the advice is just to write it out and revise it later, but if I did that, for me, I know it'll stick with me. Familiarity makes it harder and harder to edit that out. I got the first few paragraphs done after watching some clips on YouTube. It was Sir Christopher Lee reading Poe's The Raven that set the tone and cadence that I wanted. It was more stylized than the rest of the chapter, but the chapter before wrapped up and it was like I was starting the first few lines of a new book all over again. The next few paragraphs after that came from some other clips on YouTube, specifically a booktuber, Philip Chase, Dr. Fantasy, recently put out his self-published book The Way of Edan and discussed it with his editor, A.P. Canavan, a critical dragon. In one video, Canavan, his editor, brings up the prologue to discuss. The first line of it goes, "Death-like silence descended upon the temple." He goes on to point out how, for the next few paragraphs, the narrative extends the silence and builds the suspense. I think he is right to point out the use, but I don't think it'll have the same effect for every reader. Not for me, at least. How is silence conveyed when the following paragraph goes on to describe the temple, the people, for lines and lines, and you kind of forget that it's supposed to be silent? Or maybe that moment's past and we're currently in wait. Anyway, that technique where the reader is given a bit of information, then shortly thereafter they're given the full picture, I attempted that with a number count. Once I got past the first paragraphs that set up the scene for my chapter, I introduced a new character, some dialogue, and rounded out the near 2,000 words shortly after. Chapter done, 2 months. Going back, on the 3rd week after my last post, I was speaking to someone. He is a reader, and I asked him for book recommendations, and he listed Patrick Rothfuss's Kingkiller Chronicles, Joe Abercrombie's books, and several others, and I told him I've heard of those books. I even have some of them sitting on my shelf, but I haven't read them. In fact, I don't really want to read them. Not yet. This takes me way back to my high school days in my creative writing class. Our teacher had this discussion at the start of the year, one she's had in many classes with beginner writers, to which she had to disabuse the following mindsets. I want to write something new. I want to write something original. I don't want to read anything because it'll influence my writing. The first point, I want to write something new. Fact of the matter is, whatever you write, when you put it out, it'll be new. Is that something you really want? As opposed to writing something old, something that's been remembered for 10, 20, 50, or 100 years, which is better? What does it take to stand the test of time? The second point, I want to write something original. Do not be confused with this statement. It's not saying you want to write something that's never been written before. It's saying you want to write the before, because with copies, there is an original. A final draft before the published version, that's all it is. The original is what's used for copies. You might think it's so good and so popular that it demands reproduction, but there's vanity print and plenty of manuscripts where it's the one and only one, and no one wants it. The last point, I don't want to read anything because it'll influence my writing. I said this recently, and I really do want to read, but really, I have so many influences already that I just want to finish my own work. My creative writing teacher told me back then she doesn't write much herself because there's so much to read and so much to learn. I want to appreciate and thank her, but I don't want to be like her. I want to produce something. That's all I have for now. I want to thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment on the video. Bye.